Good afternoon. I'm here this afternoon to introduce Dr. Robert Bland. Dr. Bland is an assistant professor of history at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He is a historian of the late 19th and early 20th centuries with an emphasis on the African-American experience in the postbellum South. His research and teaching engaged questions of racial formation, electoral and cultural politics, and battles over historical memory. Bland received his bachelor's degree from Williams College, his master's degree from the University of Mississippi, and I discovered last night that he earned that master's degree in an impressive fashion part-time while working full-time as a high school social studies teacher in Jackson, Mississippi. And he dedicated himself to driving to Oxford to complete that degree. He then went on to complete his PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park. His publications include a terrific article from the Journal of Gilded Age and Progressive Era in April 2018, a grim memorial of its thorough work of devastation and desolation, race, class, and memory in the aftermath of the 1893 Sea Island hurricane. His current book project examines the legacy of Reconstruction in the African-American public sphere. It explores the efforts of Black South Carolinians and their northern allies to preserve the last bastion of radical republicanism in the South during the half-century following the Compromise of 1877. This research reveals a series of connections between grassroots struggles in the South Carolina Lowcountry over political patronage, disaster relief, local schools, and representations of Gullah folklore and the simultaneous debate in the national Black press over how to contest the cultural and intellectual dimensions of the emerging Jim Crow order. His presentation today is The Republican South's Last Stronghold, Robert Small's South Carolina's Republican Party, and the long coda of Black Reconstruction. His research has been supported by the Social Science Research Council, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Bland to Dickinson State and the Theodore Roosevelt Symposium.
Good afternoon, good afternoon. I just want to thank you for the very kind introduction. I want to say thank you to Michael for the invitation. I want to thank Chris for the kind of all the help getting here, the warm introduction to Dickinson, and all to the people, William, namely, for helping me find the lost paper at the last minute. And as you know, everything that can go wrong sometimes does go wrong, but everything that goes right can also go right. And I just also want to give a shout out to the folks who have built the center. And a lot of humanistic research happens in silos, and we kind of think of the scholar as someone working at an individual level. And as Julie Green knows, that is not the only way academic work happens. And at the University of Maryland, I'm the product of the Freedmen and Southern Society project, and this is a large-scale humanistic project that's annotating documents, making history more accessible. A number of top-notch scholars who are all at the top levels of the field, but coming together to build a project that illuminates history for everybody. And I think the folks at the TR Center are doing something similar, and I'm deeply gracious and happy to be here and be a small part of this symposium. I'm just going to jump in, read, stop, and give a little bit of insight into what was going on in the Lowcountry in the late 19th century. On January 1st, 1880, Ulysses S. Grant, hoping to run for a then unprecedented third presidential term, made a whistle stop in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Once the center of South Carolina's vast Lowcountry slave society, Beaufort County was the first place in the South to be occupied by the Union Army during the Civil War. The first of the rehearsals for Reconstruction, the birthplace of the Republican Party in the South, and the last battleground over the Republican-controlled State House of the former Confederacy, Beaufort County had become the lodestar of the promise of Reconstruction. At the dawn of the century's penultimate decade, the county was still seen as, quote, a Negro paradise, end quote, and invoked an unmistakable sense of awe and wonder in the eyes of white Northern journalists covering the campaign event. Coordinating his visit to coincide with Emancipation Day, Grant and his wife Julia witnessed a spectacular parade that would have rivaled any day of Jubilee celebration in the county's history. A massive parade replete with a brass band, 2 black military companies in full parade regalia, and a cavalcade of carriages, horse-drawn buggies, and other vehicles made their way to the center of the town of Beaufort and near the Port Royal train station. Arriving at 3 p.m., Grant and his wife were seated in a carriage at the front of the parade and escorted to the center of town, where he addressed a crowd of more than 5,000 people. In his speech, he explicitly evoked this history with the understanding that the black voters in attendance were the base of the Reconstruction-era Republican Party. Quote, "It has afforded me great pleasure to pay a visit to the town of Beaufort," he told his listeners. "It is a place that has occupied a conspicuous place in the history of our country for the past 20 years. And it is to be hoped that it is a place where the best of the newly enfranchised race are to be developed. I hope they will become worthy and capable citizens," end quote. Beaufort's black citizens took great pleasure in being able to reach out and see Grant. "We got him," one person shouted. "We got him," shouted another entity. "You all right, General? We're going for you. We're Republicans. Hurrah." While Grant took the center stage, the Lowcountry's own Robert Smalls orchestrated the day's festivities from behind the scenes. A former slave, a war hero, and founder of the state Republican Party, he had become a powerful Reconstruction-era politician. Smalls had been in correspondence with Grant about the campaign event and received a telegram about the time frame of Grant's visit. With only a short window of time to pull together the event, Smalls reached out to the city's leading citizens, both black and white, to ensure that as much of the community participated as possible. Leading the procession to and from the train station, Smalls, quote, looked like a monarch of all he surveyed, according to one reporter. Dressed in a broad belt, a bright sword, and gorgeous epaulettes and flowing plumes, the former general consciously coupled the pageantry of the post-Emancipation Day celebration with the memory of Reconstruction-era politics to remind all who witnessed what was potentially possible with Grant's reelection. And again, this is something that is covered in the press, kind of noted in many of the major northern papers, and it's a real moment of possibility that Grant might be elected for a third term, a third consecutive term, that Reconstruction might return to the South. And so when we look at this whistle stop, we see a number of forces at play. First, we see a Republican Party that did not disappear all at once, right? This is not a Republican Party that completely fades from the scene in 1877. While greatly diminished, leaders like Robert Smalls still envisioned a pathway for statewide, if not region-wide, Republican rule. Second, an active and vibrant black political culture continued to flourish in places like Beaufort County. Already hyper-visible in the public sphere from its place in the stories of black progress during the Civil War and Reconstruction, Beaufort and the greater Lowcountry gained an even greater level of notoriety during the 1880s, as it became one of the handful of places in the South where African Americans still held local power and continued to send black elected officials to the state legislature. Recognizing that this visibility brought attention from the northern press and the National Republican Party, South Carolina's Democrats sought to gerrymander as many of the state's black districts and black voters into a single black district. This disfranchising effort, one of the first acts of racial gerrymandering in the country's history, signaled a new chapter in the ongoing fight on the part of the state's white elites against the perceived specter of Negro supremacy. The continued activism and organization by the Republicans in the state Republican Party provided both a symbol of hope for black voters and white Northerners who saw the district as a sterling example of why the Republican Party needed to remain committed to civil rights, as also a fearful reminder to the state's white elites for the counter-revolution of 1876 that still remained an unfinished project. To put this another way, Robert Smalls and the political generation that traveled south to help build the Republican world in the South remained engaged in Republican Party politics well into the late 19th century. This fact in itself is not new. Scholars like C. Van Woodward, Edward Ayers, Jane Daly, and Elsa Barkley Brown have all noted that this disfranchisement did not descend all at once, that it was a slow process. There was process of back and forth, possibilities of interracial coalitions that shaped things like populism, fusionist movement, the readjusters in Virginia. But we have not paid as much attention to how this last generation of black Southern Republicans fought for their life's work. What tools did they use to prevent the Democratic Party from seizing the levers of power? How did they rebuild alliances with the National Republican Party and the Northern press to place political pressure on their one-time friends to act on voting rights issues? What tools, both liberal and illiberal, did the remaining Republican Party politicians in the South use to maintain their powers in those hard years in the political wilderness as redeemers sought to complete disfranchisement and Northern Republicans abandoned their former allies? This cohort, a group I call the Reconstruction generation, attempted to rebuild Reconstruction-era Republican Party. They did so by using the existing federal elections law, as well as demanding new laws that would provide stronger federal protection for voting rights. They maintained connections with the Northern press and the nascent Black press to ensure that the nation could see the Black political world that still existed and was under constant attack. Finally, they did the day-to-day work of keeping the Republican Party alive. This was not always glamorous or pristine. At times, the Low Country Republican Party looked like New York's much demonized Tammany Hall that we just heard a great presentation about. Patronage was doled out to friends. Enemies were intimidated and ostracized. Those who were hostile or simply agnostic to the future of Black politics in the South could use this as another example of the inherent corruption embedded in Reconstruction-era political project. To some extent, these critics, both Black and white, were correct in identifying the earthbound nature of the post-Reconstruction Republican Party. Gone were the soaring rhetorical and poetic heights that had once accompanied the descriptions and the visual culture of the project, and they were replaced with bare-knuckled struggles over political power. However, that this world survived at all was a testament to the long-term vision and the deep-seated belief that those members of the Reconstruction generation who remained alive and fighting in the political arena. So I'll just skip ahead a little bit and give you a kind of sense of the region I'm talking about, the greater Low Country, and why this region matters. On March 21st, 1867, members of the Low Countries Union League gathered in Charleston to create a proposal for a new state constitution. A secretive paramilitary organization that emerged in the postbellum South to provide protection and political education for free people, Charleston's Union League would call the meeting a Union Republican Convention, and from its deliberation came the framework for the 1868 Constitution. 5 days later, the first chapter of the Republican Party would be founded in the nearby town of Beaufort, and by the end of the decade, the more clandestine grassroots chapter of the Union League had been replaced across the former Confederacy by official chapters of the Republican Party, bringing together white Northerners, Southerners who opposed the former planter class, as well as Black Southerners who had been born free. The South's GOP would be stewards for the political project of Reconstruction. Over the next decade, the Republican Party in the South would rewrite the state constitutions that would guarantee universal manhood suffrage, establish public school systems for Black and white youth, and invest in public works and railroads, expand access to asylums and poor relief, and eliminate debtors' prisons. The Republican coalition in the South, composed of white and Black Northerners, freed people, and white Southerners who opposed the white planter class, offered the country and the world its first glimpse at a multiracial democracy. Looking back on the accomplishments at the end of the decade, one of South Carolina's most prominent Black politicians argued, quote, "We had built schoolhouses, established charitable institutions, built and maintained the penitentiary system, provided education for the deaf and dumb, rebuilt ferries. In short, we reconstructed the state and placed it upon a road to prosperity." Such a fundamental reversal of the social and political order was met with fierce and violent backlash. The first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan emerged in 1866 as a vehicle to terrorize Republican voters, killing a still unknown number of Black and white Republicans and Republican voters in the South during the Reconstruction era. In response to these acts of political terror, the federal government not only deployed federal troops to the formerly occupied the Confederacy, but also created what would become the modern justification for the Justice Department. Right? The modern Justice Department emerges in response to terrorist violence in the South. I'll skip ahead here. Initially supported by radical and moderate Republicans, support for Reconstruction slowly dissipated during the 1870s, financing its expansive policy goals through property taxes, a reversal from the regressive head tax system that existed in the antebellum South. The Republican Party in the South sparked fierce opposition from the former planter class, who believed that the new system of taxation was a scheme to transfer wealth from the region's white elites to free people and their white allies. Coupled with the fact that Black Southerners could now exercise the franchise and hold office, this provided an overwhelming assault on the region's white elites. First attacked by the Ku Klux Klan, Black and white Republicans in the South faced a second wave of violence during the 1870s by an assortment of paramilitary groups seeking to redeem the South for white rule. One by one, Republican-led state governments began to fall until the election of 1876, when massive violence and voter fraud cast doubt on the election returns in the states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. which left the control of the White House in limbo and kind of left a deadlocked electoral college. Recognizing that many Northern Republicans had grown exhausted of Reconstruction and embraced the arguments made by the white Southerners against it, the Democratic Party struck a grand compromise that gave the necessary electoral college votes to the Republican Party in exchange for the removal of federal troops to the South. And just to pause a second, again, when I talk about the poetic heights and kind of the promise of Reconstruction, you can see that in images like the one on the left, which again, kind of think about the Republican Party of both Lincoln and Grant, understand the kind of promise of the 15th Amendment, this move towards citizenship and the kind of role that voting rights would play, and kind of putting that in a narrative history with the pageantry of military participation, with the kind of pursuit of education, right? This is the kind of loftiest and the highest ideals that Reconstruction reaches. And then on the right side of the image, you can see this Thomas Nast cartoon that often appears in textbooks, right? To kind of understand the reversal from Reconstruction, right? Kind of led by a kind of Harper's magazine, right? This kind of liberal Republican periodical, this representation of a Northern elite, a vision of the United States, and right, the kind of seeing that Reconstruction is this earthbound project, that it's this corruption of Republican government, right? And kind of in the back we let them have peace, this quote that Grant utters kind of in the midst of running for president, right? The kind of speaking in his moment of kind of the backlash of terrorist violence, and now that's being used to kind of highlight that Reconstruction was dysfunctional, using kind of some of these racist images, right? The kind of the visual kind of narrative here of the terror and the horror, right? This is specifically right meant to kind of pull on James Pike, this Northern journalist who travels the South, writes this book, The Prostrate State, and kind of highlights for Northerners that Reconstruction had failed, that even a former abolitionist, a member of the Union Army, had backed away from Reconstruction, and therefore others would be doing the same, right? That it was okay for the North to abandon Reconstruction, right? Kind of, this is the kind of common narrative, right? Not everyone kind of enters this kind of history with the kind of understanding of the kind of duality of Reconstruction, right? This is one of the hardest moments to teach at the K through 12 level. Even at the college level, students have a kind of very minimal understanding of what Reconstruction was and what Reconstruction meant. And again, we can think about this battle happening specifically in the Low Country, right? In this kind of county of Beaufort being the center of this political world. And as soon as Reconstruction is formally kind of concluded by the removal of federal troops, we can see a number of measures that kind of reduce the power of the Low Country, namely, right, the redrawing of county borders. Beaufort County becomes subsumed by Hampton County, named after Wade Hampton, the Redemption governor who gets the governor's mansion from a split election that's kind of mired with voter fraud and violence, but is meant for white Southerners, white South Carolinians, to represent this return to good government. And so we see this struggle, we see this battle not only happening literally in the streets with violence, but also spatially. I think we'll kind of highlight some other of these spatial examples in a second. Robert Smalls built his second act of his political career as a defender of a specific vision of the Republican Party. A stalwart Republican, he continued to support the National Republican Party after the Compromise of 1877 and campaigned with Ulysses S. Grant when the former president sought a third term in 1880. When the new 7th Congressional District was created in 1882, Robert Smalls used the gerrymander not only to highlight the ongoing disenfranchisement efforts on the part of the Democratic Party, but also used the hypervisible district as an example of racial progress. He defined it as a black political mecca. Sometimes it's called the Black Seventh, but it captured the national imagination and was heralded in the black press as an example of what was possible if Northern Republicans remained committed to the question of civil rights. And so you can see this weirdly unevenly shaped district. You hear descriptions of it being like a bat. Sometimes it's described as a weasel, but it's clearly kind of, when we think about kind of the hyper precision that political gerrymandering happens now, and we kind of understand the kind of ways that those are meant to either pack voters into single districts or crack districts in a way that preserves political majorities, political supermajorities. We can see one of these first examples in South Carolina following the Reconstruction era in this district in the Low Country, the 7th district, which snakes all the way into the Midlands region of the state, represents one of these first examples of racial gerrymandering in the nation's history. Reconstruction, however, was more than a distant memory in Beaufort. The South Carolina Low Country's 7th Congressional District continued to elect Black congressmen, and Beaufort County continued to elect and appoint Black office holders to state and local positions. A robust grassroots political culture persisted in the region, and the organizations and holidays that preserved emancipation and Union memory persisted and served as anchors in the region's larger network of African American associational life. The Black press continued to cover the political events in the Low Country with a close eye, and the region's melodramatic political controversies often became referendums on the larger questions of racial uplift. These battles took place in South Carolina's newly gerrymandered 7th Congressional District. Created in 1882, South Carolina's Black district became synonymous with Robert Smalls, the district's most famous politician. Deeply in awe of the Republican Party's weakness within the state, as well as the lack of commitment from the National Party on defending political and civil rights, Smalls used the cultural capital he had accumulated as both a war hero and a Gilded Age political celebrity to fight to uphold the Republican Party, as well as make the Black public sphere accountable to the concerns of its working class constituents. And I want to kind of turn our attention to Smalls as a political celebrity, right? The kind of visual culture of Reconstruction in these woodcraft images, in the various drawings that appear both in the Republican political literature as well as the Black press, are in a sharp contrast to that racist image that we saw, the demagogic image of the kind of politicians in the Thomas Nast cartoon. And we kind of can think about the way that African Americans in the late 19th century, as political figures, wanted to control images to combat not only the efforts of disfranchisement and attacks on civil rights, but also to kind of confront the story of Black life in the world of images. And I'm here thinking namely of Frederick Douglass, who was more photographed than any other figure in the 19th century, understood deeply that his photographed image could serve as a powerful counterpoint to the images that you might encounter in a minstrel show, that you might encounter in Harper's, that you might encounter in any number of places of polite society. Despite the attacks on his character and the history represented, Smalls remained an immensely popular figure in the Low Country and Black Washington. At a moment when both Democratic and Republican parties were attacking the perceived excesses of stalwart Republicanism, and the leaders in the post-Bellum Black political sphere increasingly called on Black voters to break from the party that had betrayed them in 1877, Smalls rebuffed these claims and reminded the nation that his working class constituents and the rural South still believed in the promise of Reconstruction. More than this, he offered a counterpoint to a vision of political history offered by white and Black elites, and fought for a democratic story of Reconstruction era rooted in the specific geography of the South Carolina Low Country. And here we can think of a specific example regarding the 1886 7th Congressional District political campaign between Robert Smalls and his longtime enemy, William Elliott. Defeated in this election by just over 500 votes, Smalls deployed his connections within the National Republican Party to raise awareness of voter fraud and election irregularities. In 1887, he brought a federal suit against his Democratic political opponent, William Elliott, over the suspicious results of the 1886 election. These hearings, which included over 900 interviews and produced an 800-page report, presented a story of rampant and unrestrained voter fraud. The contestee, Elliott, Robert Smalls' side argued, is confronted at the outset by the undisputed fact that of the 39,000 voters in the 7th Congressional District, 32,000 of them are of the colored race, and at least 30,000 of them are Republican in politics. At one of the district's busiest precincts, Democratic managers closed the polls for 2 hours. Some precincts failed to open at all. One Low Country voter had traveled 34 miles to reach the county's registration office. Read in total, the evidence presented by Smalls and his attorneys demonstrated that despite the Democratic Party's 1882 gerrymander of the state, which packed the Black majority of Republican voters into a single congressional district, Democratic Party leaders were already abandoning the political détente and betraying the spirit of the earlier redistricting effort. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the South Carolina Democratic Party, which had won by fraud in the election, the contested election committee ruled against Smalls and left William Elliott in possession of the 7th District's congressional seat. And again, thinking about the kind of ways that, despite the evidence, partisanship reigned supreme here. Robert Smalls pushed the GOP to enact federal protections for Black voters in the South. With the Republican Party holding the White House and both chambers of Congress on the eve of the 1890 midterm elections, he noted, quote, "In South Carolina, there is neither a free ballot nor an honest count." And kind of frames this in the pages of North American Review, one of the kind of premier political science journals of the day. Framing the state's post-Reconstruction political history as, quote, "a continued series of murders, outrages, perjury, and fraud," Robert Smalls used the pages of the national magazine to paint a lurid picture of the New South. In counties with either white majorities or relative racial purity, the shotgun and rifle ensured Democratic victory. In counties like Beaufort, where black majorities continue to anchor Republican political power, democratically controlled election boards stuffed ballot boxes and created flimsy pretexts to throw out Republican ballots, and arrived at a false count that would ensure that victories of hopelessly unpopular Democratic candidates would continue to reign supreme. In addition, he outlined the broader structural transformations in the voter registration process that harmed black voters. Quote, "Thousands of voters," Smalls warned, "after traveling 50 and 100 miles to the county seat, the only place for registration, have to return home after fruitless search for the registrar on the days that the law requires him to be present," end quote. He understood that this system not only disfranchised the state's black majority, but also, quote, disenfranchised the poor whites who formed the bulk of the Democratic voters, end quote. And we kind of understand this story, right? The kind of disenfranchisement most specifically harmed African Americans, but these are broadly anti-democratic measures that were intended to shrink the electorate, the larger electorate, and kind of, again, see this in the work of scholars like C. Van Woodward, Michael Perman, and others. More than simply diagnosing a corrupt and deeply anti-democratic system, Smalls demanded that the Republicans in Congress act upon the federal elections bill put forth by Henry Cabot Lodge, submitted on the House floor on June 14, 1890. Lodge's proposed bill allowed constituents at the precinct level to petition a federal judge if they believed significant fraud or irregularities were occurring in the election. Quote, "The first step toward the settlement of the Negro problem and toward the elevation and protection of the race is to take it out of national party politics," Lodge proclaimed. Giving the federal government the ability to appoint supervisors who would oversee all phases of federal elections, from voter registration to certification of results, the proposed bill was demonized by Southern Democrats as a return to Reconstruction. Quote, "With both the Senate and the House Republicans, there might be some danger to us, but I don't think our friends, the enemy, will attempt any further Reconstruction measures, and even if they did, the South has advanced too far to be relegated back to Negro domination," warned a writer at the Charleston News and Courier. Perhaps this writer had reason to fear. The prospect of renewed protections for black voting rights energized the Low Country's Republican voters. At a June 27th meeting at the South Carolina Republican Association, Robert Smalls warmly endorsed the federal election bill and was given an ovation when he told his constituents that with this bill in place, the Republican Party could carry 5 out of the state's 7 congressional districts. National debates over the contested 1886 election dredged up longstanding debates over the racial legacy of Reconstruction and the specter of Negro supremacy. In the special 1880 issue of the journal The Forum, Wade Hampton, the governor who proceeded over redemption, penned an article detailing the horror of black-led Reconstruction-era governance. Where he had previously presented himself as a moderate Democrat who rejected direct appeals to white supremacy, his article, "What Negro Supremacy Means," emphasized the most racist tropes from the past decade and leaned heavily on the reporting of James Pike's Prostrate State to support his argument. Quote, "Negro supremacy," that Hampton said, relegated the spurious bribery allegation. Hampton took particular aim at Robert Smalls in this argument, and relegating a spurious bribery claim allegation and calling into question Robert Smalls' fitness for office. This is Hampton. "I'm happy to say that his constituents, apprised as they have been of his disreputable conduct and recognizing the shame that attached to them in having a representative on the floor of Congress, relegated him at the last election to the walks of private life, much to their honor," and that there here is the white Southerners. Supporting the argument that William Elliott and other Democrats had made about black voters turning the Smalls corruption case in 1886, despite having the same evidence available in 1884, Wade Hampton argued that the recent elections result from the South Carolina's black district reflected a final rejection of Negro supremacy by both white Southerners and a growing number of responsible black voters. Hampton's attack on Smalls and the legacy of Reconstruction reunited Northern defenders of black political power. In July 1888, the American Missionary published a rebuttal to Hampton's efforts to relitigate the Reconstruction era. Quote, "We make no defense of the carpetbag legislature, but does not Senator Hampton recognize that change has taken place in the condition of the Negro, a change that is going on an increased ratio?" Danish-born Niels Christensen produced his own response to Hampton, where he challenged the validity of Negro supremacy, and implicit to this argument was an ideal of racial regression. The black press also challenged Hampton's attack on Smalls in the South Carolina 7th Congressional District as an existential threat to the promise of racial destiny or racial progress. In an effort to attack this claim, another Northern writer, New York Age journalist John Edward Bruce, challenged the idea of the Negro supremacy and defended Robert Smalls in the National Negro Press. Quote, with a deliberate and cold-blooded purpose to assassinate the moral character of Honorable Robert Smalls, the argument of Negro supremacy was turned on its head, and Bruce saw this as a reanimation of a new project to defend Southern disfranchisement efforts. Bruce quoted, "The senator does not, in his learned dissertation against Negro supremacy, incorporate the whole truth of the history," Bruce argued, "and the records of those times will show that his deductions and conclusions, aside from being fearfully and wonderfully made, are terribly inaccurate." Beyond its outsized place in national debates over the meaning of Reconstruction and its legacy in South Carolina's 7th Congressional District continued to be the home of a vibrant Black political world. One of Smalls' longtime enemies, William J. Whipper, a probate judge, received considerable praise for how he ran his office. George Armstrong Reed would be one of the first Black men to be elected sheriff in the entire South and would continue to hold this position well into the late 19th century. In South Carolina, especially in the Low Country, well into the late 1880s and 1890s, Black men held office as school board, held offices in the county commission, and were serving in the coroner's office. The state's Black majority continued to send representatives to both the House and state legislatures, and the region's robust political culture served as a bulwark for sustained power of the Republican Party. Perhaps no more visible symbol of this political vitality could be seen in the formation of a local chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic. Founded in 1888, the David Hunter Post No. 9 would not only serve as a fixture in the local mass meetings and political rallies, but also acted as a vehicle for political education for local veterans and widows about the Union pension process. One white observer reported, quote, hundreds of Black Low Country residents received $10 to $40 a month from the federal government in pensions. Quote, if the Yankees of the North draw as much money to the pensions in the proportion to their population as the Negroes of Beaufort, the scarcity of money in the South can hardly be easily explained. I'll just kind of jump ahead and show you an image here of members of the Beaufort's David Hunter Post, one of these Grand Army posts, one of the handful of posts that would remain in the South well into the late 19th and early 20th century. These are largely concentrated in the Low Country. We also see kind of veterans of various US colored troop regiments, namely the 33rd United States Colored Troops, but other regiments are participating in this David Hunter Post. And to the right, we see an image from the 50th anniversary of emancipation. And again, interspersed in that crowd, you see the image of the United States flag. You have reenactments of the reading of the Declaration of Emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation. But you again see veterans, right, kind of veterans of the United States Colored Troop who remember the Party of Lincoln, remember the struggle over what Reconstruction meant. A new set of tensions, however, emerged around how the Republican Party in Beaufort should strategically align with white South Carolinians to preserve the party's political future. On one side of the spectrum stood fusionists who believed that the party should reunite with the Low Country's white elites in a form of Whiggish coalition of the region's best men. On the other side, you had those who wanted to remain in contact with the party of Lincoln, with the stalwart Republican Party. And Robert Smalls, seeing that the political winds were shifting, moves away from his former stalwart republicanism and begins to embrace this fusion ticket. Identifying itself as the people's ticket, the fusion faction offered the position of probate judge and state senator to white Democrats and offered sheriff, coroner, clerk of the court, and school commissioner to Black Republicans. This effort to divide the seat was seen as a way to preserve political control at a moment where the Republican Party's political future began to appear more precarious. This brought criticism. Small's decision, which was seen as erratic at the time, severely tarnished his reputation both locally and nationally. Thomas E. Miller, once one of his Robert Smalls acolytes who saw Robert Smalls as a political mentor, came out and directly called Smalls a betrayer. This is Miller. quote, "The so-called fusion ticket has no more right to the name than a gang of burglars out of a rob a bank would have to be called the directors of the same." Several party loyalists grumbled in the black press that Smalls was a Republican in name only. It cannot meaningfully represent the party in the year's national convention in Indianapolis. The most strident criticism came from William J. Whipper, Smalls' longtime rival. Defeated in his bid for re-election for the county's probate judge, Whipper rejected the legacy of the legitimacy of his defeat at the hands of the Fusionist Party and refused to vacate his office and turn over official records to the incoming candidate. Whipper was held in contempt and imprisoned in a Beaufort County jail. As the national press turned its attention to the bizarre political theater that was brewing in the Low Country, Whipper self-published a broadside that lambasted Robert Smalls for abandoning the Republican Party. Once the, quote, idol of the Republican Party of this county, Whippers argued that Smalls was now going into the very arms of the bloodstained democracy that he had so long and so often and so roundly denounced, a party that but a few years ago pinned him and a number of his friends in a house in Gillisonville and riddled it with bullets. And this is a specific incident that's happening in 1878, again, after the Compromise of 1877, where Robert Smalls is running for office as a congressman, and in the midst of a stump speech, a number of red shirts, the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party, march into the election, march into the campaign speech. They begin harassing the kind of attendees. Robert Smalls realizes it's too dangerous to give a speech. He returns and hides into a grocery store. And while in the grocery store, the red shirts began shooting and firing into it. And kind of Smalls and many of his close lieutenants thought they weren't going to survive until through news, many of his supporters went to the kind of surrounding areas, let people know that Robert Smalls was under attack, and they marched in with their own weapons and chased off the red shirts, allowing Robert Smalls to hop on a moving train and barely escape the region with his life. And so again, Whipper is calling on this moment to say, at one point, these were your worst enemies. Now you're joining them. What's happening here? What is the story of this political transformation? I'll close here and kind of just briefly, right? We kind of know that the Republican Party remains active in the South, namely in the story of patronage. And kind of to make this a Teddy Roosevelt story, William Crum, a native of Charleston who served as a doctor, has a tremendous fight over a patronage position that Booker T. Washington and Robert Smalls advocate for, and that Teddy Roosevelt is inclined to support and kind of helps push him through, remain in this customs house position. Robert Smalls is also in a customs house position in Beaufort County. These are kind of the handful of places where you continue to see African Americans holding federal offices. Crum is eventually removed by William Taft in kind of Taft's term, and then we know that in 1912, with the election of Woodrow Wilson, we're going to see the complete segregation of the federal government. But again, this kind of story of Republican activism often gets framed only as these battles of appointments, but I don't want to minimize that these battles of appointments matter, right? Kind of both in the visibility, but also in the kind of ability to kind of keep people within the cloak of the National Republican Party. So we'll close at the end of Robert's life. And in 1912, Robert Smalls began to experience declining health. A regular attendee at nearly every National Republican convention during his lifetime, health issues prevented him from traveling to Chicago to see the nomination of William Taft. Witty, "I'm not in good health," he told his friend, Washington, D.C. business and civic leader Whitefield McKinley. "The same troubles that caused me to go to the hospital still hangs me." With the fall's election of Woodrow Wilson, Smalls and many other black Republicans would be removed from office, and Smalls' health would continue to worsen. Complications from diabetes would require the amputation of his left foot. The once gregarious and kind-hearted figure who had once been a pillar of the Beaufort County community had become withdrawn and sullen. Some people noticed that he would yell at children, and he spent the last year of his life essentially bedbound. On February 23rd, 1915, Robert Smalls passed away at the age of 75 in his 511 Prince Street home, surrounded by family. On Friday, February 26th, his funeral was held at the First African Baptist Church, the largest funeral that the town had ever seen. His legacy was honored in several ways, from the pulpits of the church, where preachers extolled his wartime heroics, his commitment to free children's education, as well as his status as, quote, one of the most notable characters the Negro race has ever produced. You could also see it in the grand ceremonial marches held by the local chapters of the Masons and Oddfellows, as well as the Grand Army of the Republic. And finally, his memory was felt in the hearts of the larger Low Country community he had served over the course of his life. As Small's body was being viewed for the last time and the church choir sang, "Shall we meet beyond the river?" there was not a dry eye in the vast crowd that passed, described one reporter from the Savannah Tribune. Robert Small's death, in many ways, embodied a capstone for a larger story of Reconstruction's generation, the Reconstruction generation. In the national Black press's coverage of Small's death, a deep understanding of generational loss permeated across the many solemn obituaries. The New York Age, the preeminent Black paper of the country, recognized him as a national character, one of the race's most notable figures, and dedicated nearly the entire front page to recap his life's accomplishments. A year after he passed, C.J. Hardstew, a longtime reporter and writer in the Black press, visited Beaufort to try to capture the legacy of Small's story that was still a powerful part of national Black memory. Hardstew noted, "When you talk of Beaufort, it always brings you before you General Smalls, who has since gone to rest, but his name will forever live." Hardstew explained further, "I consider Robert Small as an example for the young people. He was not born with a book under his pillow, nor was he allowed to use one. But in the face that all that made his way, we went to emerge and make his record there. He pleaded for his people and was one of the strong men of America. It was a pleasure to know this." Once a complicated and at times divisive figure in local politics and the national public spheres, Robert Smalls had once again become a secular saint, both among writers and reporters, but also other individuals who were writing the first chapter of African American history. And I'll just close here and kind of think about kind of Robert Smalls at the end of his life and kind of suggest that we want to understand kind of both him as a living lion, someone who kind of saw the rise and fall of the Republican Party in the South, fought in ways that were both liberal and illiberal for this future, but also understand the larger world around him, right? And kind of the figure on the right is Hastings Gant, again, one of Robert Small's chief lieutenants in the Reconstruction of the Republican Party. And when Robert Smalls moved towards fusionism, he abandoned Gant. He kind of pushed him to the side, said, "I don't need your service, your help anymore." Gant was kind of seen as a product of an older era, again, born in slavery, never gained literacy, which was often criticized by Democratic figures, but played an important role in helping establish the Penn School, one of the central institutions of education formed by Northern missionaries. Sometimes he was made fun of. Kind of Northern visitors would say, if you're going to catch a train ride, if you're going to catch a cab ride from the Beaufort County train station, you might encounter Hastings Gant, former Republican congressman who's been reduced to kind of ferrying people back and forth. But he's also part of this story, right? There's a broader world of these figures, both high and kind of soaring like Robert Smalls, but also, right, the kind of earthbound battles over political power that required some figures to be cast aside and erased for this kind of usable past, this usable history to keep the Republican Party alive. I can say more there, but I'll close here and answer questions.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bland. Learning curve straight up for me. I don't know about most of you. Fascinating and really important, so thank you. So I'm sure the audience has questions. We have some time for this. I wanted to start by just sort of going back into the middle of your talk where you talked about gerrymandering and then voter intimidation and then some violence and ballot challenging and the lack of accessibility to registrars and registration. And there were times I thought, are you talking about them or us?
What is, I mean, the democratic process is a process, and there will always be kind of these challenges to universal suffrage. Certainly, right, the kind of history of kind of the march of enfranchisement has a specific history in this country that kind of is written in specific ways that we kind of understand as anti-Black. But there's also, right, a kind of broader impulse. And we can go back to the Madisonian moment here and think about the ways that democracy was always a watchword, right? Democracy means a kind of collapse of virtue, kind of a descent into the tyranny of the majority. And so the kind of opponents to Reconstruction, especially the ones in places like Harper's Magazine, but you can also see the ways that the smarter redeemers like Wade Hampton would kind of appeal to good government, would kind of draw these comparisons to places like Tammany Hall, right, to kind of highlight the ways that democracy is a bad thing, right? And kind of you want to return towards a more limited political sphere, right? A limited political world that allowed virtue to shine as opposed to allowing kind of spoils and patronage and corruption to kind of reign supreme. But certainly, right, we can see almost the whole toolbox of anti-democratic measures being deployed in this specific moment.
So how can that be? We're talking about the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Now we're fast forward to the 21st century, and some of the same tools are being used to discriminate against African Americans and others that were used then. And I suppose we shouldn't be surprised, but it's appalling and surprising, isn't it?
It is. I think one of the kind of ways that Reconstruction kind of is really important in kind of understanding and teaching United States history is it challenges kind of deterministic, linear kind of story of progress, and right, the kind of some of the kind of liberal exceptionalist narratives about United States history kind of imagine the progress being right around the kind of other side of the mountain, right? Kind of the journey towards, I'm butchering the Martin Luther King quote, but the kind of the arc towards justice is long.
Bending towards justice, right?
And Reconstruction tells us that you might have 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, right? The kind of that to understand what this kind of story entails means that this is not an exceptional or a moment to be bracketed, right? Actually, this might actually be the grammar of United States history. This might actually be more of what United States history looks like than the kind of exceptional kind of storming the beach at Normandy, kind of defeating kind of evil and kind of leaving evil permanently defeated.
So I just want you to say more about that, because it's a really powerful thing you just said, that so far from being Martin Luther King's arc of justice, which bends in the right way over time, you're saying this kind of systemic attempt to hold down certain parts of the population, in this case on racial grounds, might be part of the very grammar and syntax of American life throughout. You're saying that?
That's correct. And even when we think about King, right? King, there's a more radical King who is a student of this Jim Crow era kind of. I mean, I think more and more it appears to be an apocryphal quote, but King carrying around the strange career of Jim Crow, right? Kind of trying to learn from this past, understanding that some of these things are contingencies, right? They are not always there. And in that way, right, we can also learn this story of Reconstruction as cautioning us about kind of how permanent progress can be, but also kind of highlighting that the kind of most destructive anti-democratic forces are not permanent, right? And they have power, they can continue to fight. They can often have the luxury of biding time with resources to kind of fight another day. But again, this is the Du Boisian turn with kind of the history of Black Reconstruction, thinking about kind of in these radical moments where you truly see democracy at work at the grassroots level, real change is possible if not permanent.
If not permanent. So you said early in your lecture that it's a real issue trying to teach Reconstruction to K through 12 and even university students, that it's a challenge, and you suggest it's largely been a failure of teaching. Why?
Some of it is simply kind of how we structure United States history. You have to end with the Civil War and begin in 1877, so kind of Reconstruction kind of, I think almost intentionally kind of falls in this kind of donut hole where people are rushing to get to Christmas break and kind of getting back from the holidays, and Reconstruction disappears. I'm half joking. But there's also, right, the kind of, it's hard to tell a tragic story. This is David Blight, right? To understand American history is essentially a tragedy. It's hard for a lot of students to kind of wrap their minds around, right? They kind of want to believe that things will get better, right? They're inheriting a world that's better than their parents, that they will give their children a better world. Some of the kind of history that we have to kind of grapple with in Reconstruction is understanding that kind of figures like Robert Small saw the world get worse over their lifetime, right? The things that he fought for and tried to hold on to and tried to get other generations to remember slid through his hand like kind of grains of sand, right? And to teach that, right? Kind of, what do you do with that? How do you hold that? what do you do next, right? And a lot of people get into US history because there's something that you can use, you can kind of deploy, you can kind of, and you don't have to dwell, right? I think the kind of Du Boisian mission, Du Boisian kind of promise is that this is a way to truly understand what democracy looks like, right? It's not easy, right? It's not kind of ready-made, it's not kind of manner-born, but it is something that is truly remarkable when it's in progress. And again, I think the imagery and the visual culture of Reconstruction, that first political cartoon of the kind of larger portrait of kind of what Reconstruction could look like, that is one of the United States' true gifts to the world, right? The kind of this project of multiracial democracy. That is one of the things that, again, always under attack, always chimerical, right? And it's never permanent, but it is the promise of this place.
This is an unfair question, then I'll turn to the audience, and maybe offensive, I hope it's not, but so if you look at Reconstruction, is it possible that it could have worked if there had been greater will to make it work? Or was it essentially bound to fail because the embedded racial prejudices of the country, particularly the South, were not going to let this happen? It couldn't go on with that progressive program. It had to stop.
I mean, it's always hard to answer counterfactuals, but I think there were moments of contingency, right? There were moments where the road forked and you kind of wonder about the path not taken. So in the 1870s, what if Ulysses S. Grant had more stomach to kind of leave federal troops in places like Mississippi in the early 1870s or in 1876, right? Kind of, if troops had remained kind of present in a way that diminishes the levels of both political violence and electoral fraud. I think in the 1890s, this kind of debate around the federal elections bill, I didn't close that in the talk, but this is a kind of bill that dies in the Senate, right? And kind of, but if there had been more political will to kind of put in those enforcements, you might see kind of a longer Republican Party in the South, right? Again, this is also a story of demographics and numbers, right? And the ways that in places like Beaufort County, in places like southern Louisiana, you have several states where, if not black majorities, right, pluralities that would kind of prop up politicians at the local level. These fusion arrangements, things like the readjusters in Virginia, the fusion arrangement in Beaufort County, you had the willingness of some white Southerners to work with African Americans, whether it's at that level, the fusionists, which was often elitist, right, the kind of best men of both races working together, but as kind of scholars of the populist movement are very familiar with, there's also these various moments where kind of a potential biracial working class coalition, scholars debate, right, kind of how deeply those coalitions could have persisted, but again, this is kind of a Woodward's kind of vision of Tom Watson, among others, that it was a possibility, right? Kind of, and maybe you don't put the odds very high, but there was a possibility there for some of this kind of democracy.
Questions for Dr. Bland? Yes, over here.
Thank you for the presentation. You know, one of the challenges scholars of the late 19th and early 20th century face is the question of periodization. Gilded Age, Progressive Era. Did the Gilded Age even exist independently? But one of the greatest disservices that has ever been done to our understanding of the era is C. Vann Woodward saying 1877 is the close of Reconstruction. More recently, scholars like Henry Louis Gates have challenged that. I think it's fair to characterize your work as being among this historiographical trend to look at Reconstruction as something that continues far beyond 1877 and perhaps does not end until Redeemers have gained control of every little pocket of local government in the South. So if we are going to accept that Reconstruction did not end in 1877 and it continued perhaps into the first decade of the 20th century, that means the era of Roosevelt's presidency, the first decade of the 20th century, is not just the progressive era, but it is also the end of Reconstruction. So in a larger sense, if we reframe the era of Roosevelt's presidency from being viewed as part of the progressive era to the end of Reconstruction, how does that change our overall view of what's going on in the United States during Roosevelt's presidency?
No, that's a. So the kind of tentative title for this book is kind of Requiem for Reconstruction. I'm thinking about kind of the way that we're talking about something that's funereal, right? There's something there's a sense of mourning here, right? And I think that kind of Booker T. Washington as an avatar for kind of the Black South moves the kind of the direction of the Republican Party in a way where Roosevelt's work in specifically in the early 20th century engages things like this battle to appoint William Crum. But the kind of messiness of Southern grassroots democracy, right? These battles over what the Republican Party means. The kind of fight over spoils. So the kind of what's going on below this level of the Customs House is a difficult thing to square with this rise of the progressive era, right? The progressives are increasingly looking for good government. They're increasingly trying to kind of fight for civil service reform. And I think Robert Smalls understood deeply that the kind of traditional liberal instruments of democracy would expedite the death of Reconstruction. And again, it provides a messier, less desirable, less poetic version of kind of the democratic project, but it allowed Reconstruction to survive. And I think I think his critics are right that when he makes this concession with the fusionists, he is putting a fast track on the end of Republican parties, right? Kind of one of the kind of stories that kind of we tell of the early 20th century is we have the kind of rise of a lily white republicanism and the kind of black and tan, kind of multiracial, biracial Republican Party is essentially a creature of a different era. I don't think Roosevelt had the language to kind of understand and kind of frame kind of what was at stake at the grassroots democratic level, right? The kind of idea that you could have good civil servants, that you, again, William Crum is a doctor. He's a person who had been a part of Charleston's longstanding freeborn elite. His family had been free when most people had been enslaved. This is someone who Du Bois would have called a member of the talented 10th. But kind of to understand what Reconstruction fully means, we have to understand the world of the Hastings Gants, right? The individuals like Robert Smalls who represented the messier side of democracy, right? In the same way that Tammany Hall represents the messier and sometimes the less pleasant, but also the kind of, this is how democracy functions sometimes, right? This is how you count votes. This is how you build alliances. This is how you keep people coming back to the polls.
Other questions? We're missing yes in the back here.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I'm a longtime Navy veteran, currently the Chancellor of the system. But I wondered, I'm still involved with the Navy, in addition to my duties here. I'm on the Navy's Education Reform Task Force. And I find it fascinating that the Union Army and the Union Navy was, as you just mentioned, the key guarantor of African-American rights, former slave American rights, and then something flipped. And interestingly, in the Navy, we had named a number of ships and buildings after Confederate figures, which is only now being undone. And maybe you were even part of this, but the USS Chancellorsville, which celebrated the Southern victory, is now named after Mr. Small, which is fascinating. I'm just wondering if any of your work, has anybody, you or others, touched on how the military had switched kind of roles? Because from the time I taught at Annapolis, I thought Porter and Grant would roll in their graves to think we were putting Confederate names on buildings and ships, because it never would have happened while they were alive. It happened much later. But any thoughts on how the military kind of flipped their role from the guarantee protector and then becoming actually an entity that carried the names of Confederates from ships to buildings to forts? And if you want to comment on the renaming process too, it'd be interesting.
I really appreciate that question. A major turning point is the Woodrow Wilson administration. As Confederate memory gets supported, right, kind of Robert Small's death, right, kind of happens within weeks of the premiere of Birth of a Nation, the kind of tremendously racist film, but also, right, kind of the cornerstone of modern American cinema, right? This is how we get the kind of language of modern cinema, the modern motion picture, but also, right, the kind of spurs the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan, sees kind of a increase of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. In the Low Country, right, the kind of local naval base at Paris Island becomes the arbiter of these Decoration Day and Emancipation Day celebrations, and once these were kind of celebrations of Black freedom that brought in major naval figures in the 1880s, 1890s. Robert Smalls was still connected to major figures, and right, the kind of story of Black freedom had to be connected with this larger Union cause. By the time we get to World War I, the Navy is more policing these celebrations, right? The kind of African Americans were once literally at the front of these parades, and now they're at the back of these parades, right? And kind of see kind of the U.S. military supporting these, and again, one of the kind of major kind of debates that's happening at the time. This is Chad Williams' recent book called The Wounded World that's writing about Du Bois and Du Bois's thinking around African-American participation in World War I, both as kind of a patriotic effort, but also trying to kind of think about the place of African-Americans in this broader global moment. And he gets criticized, and kind of the moment falls short because, again, this is not a move that moves the nation towards a more egalitarian direction. In fact, African-American soldiers often return and find themselves attacked in uniform or told explicitly in racist language that despite their service, they were going to return to second-class citizenship. And kind of that long interrectum in the interwar period is largely kind of a moment, this is Blight, right, thinking about reconciliation, right, to rebind the nation, right, to finally heal these wounds of North and South division, right, that has to be done on the kind of foundation of white supremacy. World War II is a little bit of a turning point. You have the Double V campaign. There's a naval station in, I believe it's Minneapolis, that's named after Robert Smalls, designed to train African-American sailors. And obviously kind of Roosevelt, right, kind of first in kind of executive order, and later and during the Truman presidency, officially desegregating the military. The military again becomes kind of at the vanguard of integration, and right, kind of one of these repeating themes in U.S. history is, on the one hand, right, we kind of understand kind of people who have kind of genuine anti-military views, understanding the kind of dangers and the kind of precarity that African Americans might face in the military, or the kind of racism they might face in the military. But in every moment, whether it's the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, you see African American leaders use those military moments to kind of make emboldened claims for citizenship, right? The kind of ability to kind of sacrifice your body, your life for the nation, is accompanied with kind of a more robust, right? Kind of Lincoln, kind of in moving towards a wartime Reconstruction policy, has difficulty, right, imagining for much of his life, imagining African Americans as full citizens, especially political actors, but he would carve out a kind of category for African American soldiers to say, if these men were willing to fight and lay down their lives for the Union, it's hard to make an argument, it's impossible to make the argument against enfranchisement and full citizenship.
Other questions? We have one here. All the way. While we wait for Chris to get here, let me ask you this question. So you didn't say a lot about Theodore Roosevelt. The closest you got was Lodge, his best friend, with that really important bill that stalled. How much of this do you think Roosevelt understood? He read a book a day. He was a very well-educated man. How much of what you lectured about would he have been familiar with?
That's a great question, and I'm stepping out on a speculative foot. I've not done my own research here, but a man of his station who came out of the intellectual world that he did would have likely encountered the ideas of William Burgess and William Archibald Dunning, right? And kind of that Dunning School intellectual world, right? These are the kind of founders of the modern American historical profession, but also kind of the creators of the lost cause narrative, right? The myth of the lost cause is happening both at the grassroots level. Kind of obviously people are writing and kind of pushing forward Confederate monuments as early as the 1860s and 1870s, but the kind of the intellectual wing of that movement, right, is being produced at Columbia University. It's being produced by the nation's intellectual elites, and in that way, right, kind of the kind of scholars that kind of were producing the ideas that T.J. Stiles described in his lecture last night, right, kind of this kind of civilizationist narrative, right, the kind of idea of kind of an Anglo-Saxon kind of exceptionalism, right? If Roosevelt was kind of comfortable in kind of espousing those ideas with regards to progress is incremental at best, and right, kind of you can't move too quickly in terms of democracy. He would have likely been sympathetic to, I mean, most Americans were sympathetic to Dunning, right? This was a consensus view, right? We understand it to be deeply racist now, but if you were a serious historian, right, this is what serious history sounded like in the 1890s and early 20th century.
I'll come back to that. Go ahead.
Thank you for that really interesting perspective. Clay, you made the comment, I think it was a quote from Martin Luther King, who said the arc of justice. Anyway, jump ahead to almost 100 years later, and Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. And I think it was a quote from LBJ, did he say when he signed the Civil Rights Act, he said, "There goes the South" for the Democratic Party? I was wondering if either of you both could comment on that.
Go ahead.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that we kind of, I mean, this is Woodward again, kind of civil rights as the second Reconstruction, right? And kind of what we get in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are enforcement mechanisms for the 14th and 15th Amendment, right? So in a lot of ways, right, this is, again, this repeating same, right, this grammar of American history, right, the kind of fight for justice, and then we might think about the Southern strategy and the realignment of the two parties, right, the kind of Democratic Party becoming more Northern-based, kind of depending more on African Americans in the North and the South, Republican Party becoming a more Southern party, right, as this kind of new redemption, right, a kind of a third redemption where, again, right, kind of one of the things we see in the Civil Rights Movement, right, is the return of the Confederate battle flag. Before the kind of march towards the marches on Selma, the kind of the boycotts in Montgomery, right, you would only see the Confederate flag in Southern fraternity houses, maybe Southern sports games. At the point that you have the kind of Civil Rights Movement emerging in full force, you begin to see the Confederate battle flag appear in front of state houses. You begin to see counter-protests in the Civil Rights Movement, and the flag being displayed prominently among kind of white citizens' councils and kind of white Southerners who are protesting civil rights. So in a lot of ways, right, this is right, the story of civil rights and its backlash, right, is a familiar story if we're familiar with the story of Reconstruction.
So I want to go back to Roosevelt, since that's our theme. My sense is that he was not lamenting the failure of Reconstruction, that he felt that on the whole it was better to bind the white America back together after the chasm, and the rights for African Americans would come, but it would take time. And he was very cautious, so he invites Booker T. Washington to dinner, but then never again invites another African American to dinner. Peter Findlay Dunn said, you know, for Roosevelt it was always on the one hand and yet on the other hand. Do you have any thoughts about how to evaluate Roosevelt's own position in all of this? Because he's net positive on race, at least African Americans, and yet disappointing in so many ways, considering what a bold and enterprising man he was.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do want to understand past figures as moments of their time, right? The kind of synthesis between Washington and Roosevelt is instructive here, right? I mean, we know Booker T. Washington most famously for the kind of Atlanta Compromise speech, right? And kind of this is defending a New South consensus, moving away from political rights and civil rights, but also thinking through, right, either through back channels, right, ways to support African American institutions, and therefore getting funding from Northern philanthropists, people who would have been part of Roosevelt's social and economic class, to support African American schools in a way that is better than nothing, right? It's a kind of, I think, kind of politics is the art of the possible, and Booker T. Washington was a master of the art of the possible. In that way, right, there's a middle ground being drawn. Again, Washington in his own writing is very hostile to Reconstruction in a way that I think would have disappointed many, but even Robert Smalls, right, kind of kind of arch defender of Reconstruction, invites Booker T. Washington to Beaufort County in 1908 for a Decoration Day celebration, understands the important national value of Booker T. Washington, sees kind of Booker T. Washington's light kind of outshining his, but understands, right, politics is the art of the possible, right? This is a person who understands that you don't always get what you want, but you fight for as much as you can hold, and you fight another day. It's a person who still believes in the Republican Party of Roosevelt, still believes in the Republican Party of Taft. So I think there's a kind of, again, understanding kind of historical figures as products of their time, understanding that racism of that time, again, was prolific, right? It was not, I mean, and there are different variations, right? The kind of, to be against lynching was kind of different than being against disfranchisement, which was different than being against kind of fraternizing across the color line, right? And kind of, in the same way, kind of scholars of abolitionism, right? There's a difference of a broad anti-slavery versus being John Brown. Most people weren't John Brown, and we kind of have to understand that in a historical context.
One more question, yes. One of the two of you.
Oh, okay. You were mentioning the nomination of 1880, and I was wondering, were most black Republicans in the stalwart camp? And if so, like, how did they feel in the following years when the Blaine side of the party really continued to control the party and the stalwarts kind of went by the wayside after the Arthur administration?
That's a great question. Most African-American figures in the South remained stalwart Republicans, at least until you get to this late 1880s or 1890s moment and kind of fusionism becomes more prominent. Among kind of the talented 10th, the educated elite, you do see kind of embracement of James Blaine and kind of various measures for reform that kind of, they're often pointing to Robert Smalls and saying, again, these figures who hadn't received elite educations, who kind of embodied what they perceived to be the worst excesses of Reconstruction, were figures of the past. And they were, again, pushing for figures like Robert Brown Elliott, who, again, served alongside Robert Smalls, died young, but had been educated at Eton, kind of was one of the most brilliant figures during Reconstruction. Thomas Fortune, editor of the New York Age, becomes a prominent kind of he splits prominently from the stalwart Republican faction, calls on African Americans to kind of use their votes more judiciously. The kind of stalwart Republicans had abandoned African Americans, that the African American vote continued to have power, but only if kind of it wasn't a guarantee that the Republican Party would receive that. There were kind of half steps towards kind of appealing towards the Democratic Party, but this was always a minority, and kind of the kind of general push of kind of African Americans, especially at the grassroots South level, was to kind of support the mainstream Republican Party.
So remember, everyone, tomorrow we'll have another chance to talk with all of our scholars except Julie Green, who has to leave, unfortunately. She doesn't want another trip in the mud out in Medora. So we'll forgive that, but we'll have a chance to continue that conversation with all the scholars in Medora. It's one of the most exciting parts of this, and we look forward to much more from you, Dr. Robert Bland.